Amen.
Okay, and I'm going to hit go live. And I'm at a bit of a disadvantage. Okay. Okay, so I'm Terry Camersell here with Creation Fellowship Santee. We're a group of friends bound by our common agreement that the creation account as told in Genesis is a true depiction of how God created the world and life in just 6 days, about 6,000 years ago. We met for about 10 years in person at the Creation and Earth History Museum in Santee, California, but took to this online platform in June of 2020 and haven't looked back. God has blessed us with presentations from scientists, doctors, authors, pastors, cartoonists, prophecy speakers, and all around smarty pants people who love the Lord and have a message to share. You can now find links to most of our past presentations by typing in tinyurl.com/CF Santee. That's C for creation, F for fellowship, and Santee is SANTEE. Or you can email us at creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com so that you get on our email list and don't miss any of our upcoming speakers. We promise that we won't spam you. Joe and Stacy Gaona have been our friends and members for many years. And since Joe's homegoing last year, we always want to honor his memory by mentioning his the continuing work of his ministry Throughout All Ages. Throughout All Ages Ministries focuses on reaching people with the gospel, contending for the faith, and stirring the body to love and good works. Although they enjoy street witnessing and other evangelistic events, God has blessed them with the unique opportunity of going into public schools and speaking to young people on relevant topics. You can learn more about Throughout All Ages Ministries at throughoutallages.com. Naturally, most of our weekly topics are creation themed, but from time to time, we are blessed with some off-topic presentations too. Tonight, it may seem we are off topic because we have a special guest speaker, author and filmmaker Trevor Loudon here to talk to us about the documentary Enemies Within the Church. However, you will hear a lot of mention tonight and in that film about communism and socialism. In the Creation and Earth History Museum in Santee, where we got our start, there is a hallway devoted to the reality that ideas have consequences, and that evolutionary thinking leads to ideologies such as communism and socialism. Although he's here to talk to us about enemies within the church, before that, Trevor Loudon wrote the book, The Enemies Within, in 2013, and narrated and hosted the documentary of the same name in 2016, exposing ties of high-level elected US politicians with their radical anti-American allies. Trevor, who is from New Zealand, has actually been researching the topic for over 30 years, so he had much to contribute to the 2021 Enemies Within the Church documentary. Trevor Loudon is a contributor to the Epoch Times and maintains his own website, New Zeal, Lighting the Torch for Liberty. You can find that and more information about Trevor at trevorloudon.com. And if you have questions during his presentation, if you're in Zoom, you can put them here in the chat. If you're watching along on Facebook, you can put them into the comments. And at the end of his presentation, I'll ask those questions for you. But to start out with, Trevor, what happened to the church in America?
Well, thanks for the great and very thorough introduction. It was very good. You've done your research. Okay, so to start with this, what is revolution? You know, we are given three main institutions by God to govern us. We're given the church, we're given the family, and we're given civil government. Now, all three of those institutions are under attack right now. And it leads with the church. If the church is strong and leading and everybody looks to it for moral guidance, the families are sound and civil government stays within its boundaries. But if the church goes astray or abandons its leadership role, the families fall apart and the civil government gets out of control. And I think that's where we are now. So this revolution is overturning those natural institutions given to us by God. This is ultimately satanic. So the devil wants to overthrow God's work on earth as part of overthrowing God in heaven. You know, it's a futile exercise, but he can do a lot of damage in the process if we let him. So if you were a Marxist at the beginning of the 20th century, you wanted a world revolution, and the number one impediment was the United States of America. And the backbone of the United States is, of course, the church, the Christian church. The Constitution came out of the Bible. Representative government came out of Mosaic law. America was the first country in world history founded on the concept that rights come from God, not the government. You don't have constitutional rights, you have God-given rights protected by the Constitution. So the very first communist front in America was the Methodist Committee for Social Action back in 1907, even before the Bolshevik Revolution. In the early 1920s, the Communist Party in this country told its members, if you're brought up Baptist, go back to the Baptist. If you're brought up Catholic, go back to the Catholic Church. If you're brought up Jewish, go back to the synagogue. They sent their people into the religious institutions, not to learn from them, to bring them into socialism. The Catholics thought they were safe because they would, to infiltrate the leadership of the Catholic Church, you have to take a lifelong vow of celibacy and become a Catholic priest, then a bishop, then a cardinal, then maybe a pope. Pope Francis is a Marxist, for instance. So, but they thought they were safe because no young communist would do that. But Bella Dodd, who was a Catholic who became a communist, then went back to her faith, testified before the US Congress in the 1930s that she'd put over 500 young men into the Catholic priesthood, 500 young communists. And I think many of them were homosexual, and they didn't have to worry about a lifelong vow of celibacy. And that's where the church got hit with the double whammy of a leftward drift and the pedophile priest problem. By the 1960s, when they had Vatican II, the big liberal shift, a lot of these young communists were now bishops or even cardinals. But there was a big thing that happened in the 1960s that had its roots in the 1920s. Now, some of you may have heard of the term situation ethics. Now, situation ethics means to abandon the Old Testament laws, to abandon the 10 Commandments and adopt a new moral system. Now, it was popularized in 1966 when a man called Joseph Fletcher wrote a book of that name. And his argument was simple. We're living in a complex world. Our moral bearings are not up to what is expected of us. We need a new morality. We need situation ethics. We look at each moral problem in context. We get all the context, we look at the circumstances, we look at the situation, then we make the most loving decision. Now, you could argue this. Say a young woman who might be 26 years old, and she's in a PhD program at a very prestigious Ivy League college. She's invested $200,000 in her education. She's got a brilliant future ahead of her. She's going to do lots of good. But then she falls pregnant. And she's thinking, well, this is very inconvenient. This is going to ruin my career. It's going to waste all my money. I won't be able to do the great good that I was going to do. And I won't be able to give this child within me the kind of loving environment that it needs as a two-parent family. Maybe the most loving thing to do, given the circumstances, will be to have an abortion. That is situation ethics. The pastor who says, well, I've got a new church here, I've got a big mortgage, I want to preach the gospel as it's written, but I notice when I do preach some of the tough parts of the Old Testament and some of the hellfire and brimstone parts and the sin and repentance and some of the harsher parts, a lot of my people get very, very antsy, and some of them don't come back. Maybe the more loving thing to do would be to just focus on the soft, loving parts of the Bible, dumb down the message a little bit. That'll keep more people in my church. Maybe that's a more loving thing to do. That's situation ethics. Most moral decisions in America are made on that framework today. Look at what's around you and make the loving decision. It's basically a way to justify almost anything you really want to do anyway, and give it a moral veneer. Well, that concept came out in 1966. It took the country by storm. It took the church by storm. It certainly, it was the hippie era. Dr. Spock, the leftist, been telling every American parent, don't discipline your kids, be their friend. You had a spoiled, rotten generation, and situation ethics was just perfect. And we've never recovered from it. Well, Joseph Fletcher, after he wrote his book, he left the church and declared himself an atheist and started up a group proposing euthanasia for handicapped children up to the age of 10 years old. Back in the 1930s and late 20s, Joseph Fletcher had been involved in Communist Party fronts in Cincinnati, Ohio. Then he was involved in the Communist Sharecroppers Union of Alabama. Then he moved to Harvard, Boston, and started moving up the church hierarchy. He was a very respected professor at the Episcopalian Divinity School at Harvard. Wrote books, lectured all over the world, very, very respected Christian. He also helped Margaret Sanger set up Planned Parenthood. He was a leader of the American Soviet Friendship Society, a Communist Party front, and the World Peace Council, a Soviet front group set up by Stalin to demilitarize the United States. He was identified as attending Communist Party meetings in Boston on a regular basis. The man was a Marxist-Leninist. He was a communist pretending to be a Christian, and he transformed the morality of a nation. He couldn't have done that outside the church. He couldn't have done that as a labor organizer. He couldn't have done that as a Black Lives Matter radical. He had to do it inside the church because the church has the moral authority needed to get this kind of message to many people and give it credibility. Well, by the time the 60s had rolled around, the 70s had rolled around, most American churches were completely controlled by socialists and Marxists. They were affiliated to the National Council of Churches, which was affiliated to the World Council of Churches, which was called the the Communist Party of Prayer. It was affiliated with the KGB. Meanwhile, the evangelical churches had exploded. A lot of people had left the socialist Christianity and gone onto evangelicalism. The Baptist church was very, very strong. The Southern Baptists, very socially conservative, very biblically, a lot of biblical integrity, because they all believed, these people, that, and they all tended to be very politically conservative, because they reasoned that if you believe in free will, that we have a choice between good and evil, we must be designed to live in a free nation, a free country, a constitutionally protected country. There's no point having free will in a socialist or communist country, so therefore that's not God's design for us. But there was a group of Marxists in the 1970s who tried to, and these evangelicals, they're the ones who elected Ronald Reagan. They're involved in the moral majority, the Christian coalition. They were pro-free enterprise. They were pro-constitution. They're pro-Israel, pro-America, very, very patriotic. But there was a counter group, a small group of evangelicals who were basically Marxists. People like Richard Mao, who'd been in Students for a Democratic Society, Jim Wallace, who had also been in Students for a Democratic Society, Ron Sider, and others. And they established in 1973 a thing called the Chicago Declaration. And it was an attempt to build a left-wing movement inside the evangelical churches. It was all about social justice, diminishing America's role in the world, diminishing America's military, equal redistribution of wealth, all this kind of thing, bringing socialism into the evangelical movement. But by and large, the evangelicals wanted nothing to do with it. You know, they were getting ready to fall in love with Ronald Reagan and save America from the Marxists. They didn't want a socialist church. So this movement fizzled out. But many of the members went into the seminaries and the Bible colleges, and they started to build up their influence in those institutions. At the same time, this is the Vietnam War era. You had a lot of American young communist radicals, street level radicals, SDS members, Weather Underground members, etc., who didn't want to be drafted to go and fight their communist brothers in Vietnam. Instead, they took deferments and went and fought for socialism in the Bible colleges and the seminaries. So this movement, this penetration of the evangelical churches really started in the 1970s. By the 80s and the 90s, these were people were moving up the hierarchy. By the early 2000s, many of these people were running Bible colleges. They were writing books. They'd set up the Gospel Coalition. They had set up the Sojourners. They'd set up all Red Letter Christians, all these organizations, and they were all about social justice Christianity, what we now call woke Christianity. And they were starting to gain influence. But these crazy evangelicals and the Southern Baptists were still going out there, and they were voting for Ronald Reagan, who set the communist agenda back for years. And then a few years after that, they voted for George Bush, who didn't quite set the communist agendas back so far, but at least he went through the motions. George Bush too, that was. And then a few years after that, they all voted for Donald Trump. And Trump really, really screwed the communists up in a big way, especially the Chinese. So, and we've got to understand the world communist movement is still going. You know, the invasion of Ukraine is part of this, the threatening of Taiwan, that's communism. The LGBTQ movement is Marxist. The Black Lives Matter is a Chinese communist operation. We have communism all around us. We just don't call it that because we don't know what it is or its roots. You know, the critical race theory in the schools is communist. The environmental movement, the open borders movement, the anti-gun rights movement, the feminist movement, all of these are Marxist movements, and they're all very active in America today, but most people don't connect the dots. We're in a revolution right now. So in 2005, and I'm going to name a few names here, and some people might read their books and they might gasp and be a bit horrified, but we've done our research. You know, Tim Keller, who had a very deeply socialist background, but poses as a conservative, set up the Gospel Coalition. And this had many spin-offs, and they started to put out some arguments here. The old Marxists in the churches would preach 90% Marxism and 10% Christianity, and it wasn't enough. So now the new breed, the Tim Kellers of the world and the Mark Devers and people like that, they preach 90% gospel and 10% Marxism. It's much more palatable. And so they started to spread these social justice messages, and there's LGBTQ friendly messages, and these welcoming refugees across the border messages, and there's environmental messages. They started to infiltrate them into the conservative churches, into the Southern Baptists through people like Russell Moore and J.D. Greer and even Al Mohler, unbelievably enough, but he was part of this. And they got into groups like InterVarsity and Campus Crusade for Christ, now known as Cru. These organizations are woke now. They are Marxist. Don't send them your money. Don't let your kids be indoctrinated by them. They're not the same as they were when you were in college. I can tell you that for sure. You go to a Campus Crusade for Christ webinar, they say God at the beginning, Jesus at the end, and there's 2 hours of Marxism in the middle. It's all critical race theory. It's all white privilege. It's all Marxism. I'll give you an example. InterVarsity is another organization like this. there was a big, we have this in our movie. We've done a 2-hour documentary, Enemies Within the Church. We had over 100 whistleblowers from seminaries, from crew, etc. Only 10 of them would come on camera, but they gave some devastating testimony. And one of them, this InterVarsity one, we show an example in 2015. There was about 4,000 kids. 4,000 kids at an InterVarsity conference in St. Louis, Missouri. And because it's the Midwest, they're mostly white. And the keynote speaker was a young black pastor from St. Louis, Missouri, called Michelle. I've just forgotten her name. I'm sorry. Michelle something. It's in the movie. You can see it. And Michelle Higgins. And she got up and berated these kids. Their mission from God was to end their white privilege. This was the #1 sin, the sin of racism. These kids, they could be on food stamps, but they had white privilege over the black football player with $40 million a year. They're part of the oppressive class. The concept of white privilege was invented by 2 Communist Party members, Noel Ignatieff and Ted Allen, back in the 60s. It basically, it's a concept. The old communist revolutionary strategy of the workers rising up against the capitalists doesn't work very well in America. So they adopted Marx's principles to race. Now it's the oppressed peoples of color will rise up and take away the wealth and the power of the white capitalist Christian patriarchy. This is the message of Black Lives Matter. So, and it's in churches all over now. So they were told to end their white privilege. This is a Marxist concept. They were not told that Michelle Higgins was a member of the Organization for Black Struggle. That is the communist group that burnt Ferguson, Missouri to the ground in 2014. It's a front for another communist group called Liberation Road. That's the group that set up Black Lives Matter. That works directly for the communist Chinese. Black Lives Matter is a communist Chinese front, but their message has been accepted in churches all over America now. So what we're getting to is this. We're getting to a stage where the churches, the Bible colleges in particular, are where the universities were 10 years ago. Heavily Marxist infiltrated. Not all of them are, the majority are to some degree or another. They're well on the way to being completely taken over, and they're turning out thousands of new indoctrinated pastors who are going to change the whole direction of the American church, the world church, because this is happening everywhere. So we need, if we're going to save the church, we need to understand what real Christianity is, and we need to understand what fake Christianity is. We need to be able to differentiate. So Enemies Within the Church names the names, shows the programs, shows the history, interviews whistleblowers, and lays out very clearly where modern Christianity is being attacked by bona fide Marxists in the Baptist church, in the mainstream churches, in the evangelical churches, and it's transforming American Christianity into something unrecognizable, completely unrecognizable. You can go to a lot of churches in America today. You'll hear very little about hell or the Old Testament or being held to account. You will hear about your white privilege. You will hear about social justice. You will be worrying about a lot more about global warming than sub-global warming. You'll be, basically becoming a left-wing Christian, which is not a Christian at all. It's just somebody who believes they're a Christian, but it's basically being taught Marxism. And this will be the fate of millions of young American kids who go to the church for their first time and don't know any different. Churches are being destroyed over this right now. Churches are being twisted and corrupted and perverted and taken out of the political sphere and just being turned into instruments of the state. That's the current state of the American church. And some of you may think I'm exaggerating. I don't know what part of the country you're in. There's always good churches wherever you go. They tend to be smaller. They often tend to be non-denominational. The bigger the denomination and the bigger the church, the more likely they are to run into trouble. So we did the movie so people can identify the problem. They can identify the crime that's been committed against the church. They can have ammunition to take to their pastor, to take to their board of elders, to take to their fellow churchgoers, to say, this is what they're teaching now. This is what the youth pastor is teaching. This is Marxism. Are we going to allow this in our church? And you can speak with credibility. You can actually give an argument to why this is Marxism, why this is not Christianity, how it's been infiltrated. And this movie is going all over. We're translating into 9 languages, including Portuguese and Spanish and Korean and Japanese, Chinese, French, German, Italian. We're going to get it all around the world. It's going like hotcakes in America. People are buying 100 copies at a time, taking it to their church, taking it to their pastor. It's creating quite a storm out there. It really is. And I think every Christian should see it. It doesn't mean they're going to agree with everything in it, but I'm sure you'll find if you do and you check out the evidence, it will all stack up. Every non-Christian should see it as well, because if we lose the church in America, we lose the culture and we lose the politics, we lose freedom in America. It's all over. So we're in a critical situation. The devil is inside God's church, right inside, and he's preaching from the pulpit, and thousands of them every Sunday. This is not a healthy situation, and we need to be aware of it. There's no point listening to a webinar like this on a Thursday night and going to a socialist church on a Sunday. It ain't going to do you a lot of good. So I'll call it quits there for the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions, any pushback, any comments, any criticisms of what I've said so far. I'm sure what I've said may have shocked or upset one or two in the audience, but I'm happy to take questions.
I think we have, like, I've seen the film and a few of us have, but I think we have some people who haven't that might be digesting what you've just said. So we do have some questions. Robin, did you want to ask something first?
I was just going to say, I never knew who Tim Keller or Al Mohler was until this movie.
Okay.
Because I don't know, I like the Bible, and I, believe in Jesus and creation. So I've never really followed any preacher. I didn't realize how popular it is to follow people and to quote them.
Yeah, and I think you're on the right track. Really, if people read their own Bible and really live it, they're going to learn more than going to this massive mega church and listening to some pumped up preacher. But there are millions of people in these big denominations. Like Al Mohler is a deeply followed Christian in this country. Tim Keller, people love his books. They quote from him. He's very popular, and he's leading people astray. So you may not be aware of these people, but I'll tell you what, people around you are certainly aware of these people and are being influenced by these people. And if you're a radical, if you wanted to destroy America, would you not want to get inside God's church? Wouldn't that be the place you could do the most damage? Because that's what they're trying to do.
They have certainly succeeded. Thank you.
They have.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Tim Keller specifically, I've been posting a lot of stuff getting ready for this. And so I've been posting it even for my own friends and fellow churchgoers. And it's been kind of interesting to see some feathers get ruffled. Like, they make comments
I can
like,
imagine.
oh, well, everything I've read of Tim Keller's is really good. And I'm thinking that's not a reason to promote somebody. Like, if the only thing I ever read from Adolf Hitler was the quote that that, repeat a lie often enough and people believe it. Well, that's true. So
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. Well, let's see, this is the thing, Tim Keller, we went through 10 years of Tim Keller's sermons, and he quotes Marx or postmodernist philosophers something like 180 times in 10 years. His concept of reweaving society is just that. It comes from John Perkins, who was an open communist, and it's redistribution of wealth. That's what it is. And Tim Keller is a registered Democrat who hated Donald Trump. It came out, and that alerted a few people. But on biblical issues, he's quite conservative. Social issues, he's quite conservative, abortion, etc. But some of his friends are just getting more and more radical every day. They have this great little scam they have going. It's See, they want people to vote for the left. They want people to vote for Democrats. So what they say is, now don't get hung up because the Democrats are so pro-abortion. If the Democrats get their social policies in which alleviate poverty, which are the main cause of abortion, they will argue, voting Democrat will actually reduce abortion. How about that? That's an argument coming out of the Gospel Coalition, the whole of life argument. If you're pro-life, you've got to protect life all the way through, and you've got to protect life by giving everybody government money from the cradle to the grave. That's one of their devious little arguments.
And to what Robin was saying too about reading the Bible and not other people, in the film, I remember something that stood out to me, that they talk about how cashiers learn how to recognize counterfeits by studying the correct ones. So that is
Well, that's right. If you've got a very, very strong biblical worldview and you really know your Bible, you're not going to be sucked in very easily by this stuff. You're going to know that Black Lives Matter is not a biblical organization. You're going to know that the Bible isn't about race. You're going to know about the Bible believes in borders in countries. It doesn't believe in illegal immigrants breaking laws. He who will not protect his family is worse than an infidel. So you'll be aware, but a lot of people are not. They have a very shallow learning. They go to these big mega churches. They basically get fed a watered down version of the Bible. They listen to some rock music. They have some coffee at the shop, talk to their buddies, and that's their spiritual connection over for the week. And then they do it all again the week after. Those people are easy meat for this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Easy meat. And the young people that are coming in, the young people think, well, I haven't been to church since I was a kid. I'm really drifting in life. I really don't know where I'm going. I need to go back to church. But when they go back to church, it's not the church they went to when they were 5 years old. It is social justice and critical race theory, and it's all about global warming and LGBTQ friendly, all this kind of stuff. And that they either leave or they adopt this new kind of socialist Christianity. So yeah, it's great that, well, obviously people on a call like this, you've got a very strong biblical worldview or you wouldn't be here. But a lot of Christians don't have that. And they're the people who are falling by the wayside right now.
We do we have replays. So we're hoping, my goal is to get the word out to as many people, because this will be posted to a social media platform. We're kind of on thin ground with YouTube, so your words will go out. So that's it. Thank you.
I don't know how long it will last on YouTube, but all the rest sounds good.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah, it's possible. I won't put it on YouTube, but it'll be on BitChute and Rumble.
Yeah, well, that's right. But they'll put it on YouTube just for the joke of it and see how long they take to take it down.
Well, we're at 2 strikes, so we have to be real careful.
Well, I'll be surprised you've even got a channel left, to be honest, but good for you,
So, okay, we have a question from Erica. She says, we just left a church that started cozying up to a group called North Alabama Pastors United for Change. which has a mission of addressing and attempting to fix racism and promote racial and social justice. What is the right way for Christians and the church to speak out against racism, because remaining silent isn't good either, without going full woke? And then how do you approach a pastor who is beginning to steer his church down the woke path?
Yeah, good questions. Well, I would say it's very easy. The Bible gives you, do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. That's all you need to know about racism. Now, that might not be a satisfying answer, but I think it's the most valid one. We get obsessed by this stuff. As long as you can say in your heart you treat everybody like you want to be treated, you shouldn't even have to address the issue of racism. What happened before you were born is not your responsibility. This the whole idea they give you. We've got some kind of collective guilt because of what happened with the Klan in the 60s and this Jim Crow, and that is nothing to do with us. Dealing with those problems is completely unbiblical. On that basis that we have this collective guilt from what our ancestors did. It's what we do as individuals that count. And so do unto others, and basically say, if anybody gets into this stuff, you say, look, this is Marxism. This is divisive Marxism. You've got the movie there, say, this comes out of Ted Allen and Noel Ignatieff of the Communist Party USA. We shouldn't be involved in this stuff. So if you've got a pastor who's going down this road, this is a very tricky one, because the reason this movie was made is because my friend Judd Saul, who the director was in a little independent Baptist church in Northeast Iowa, and when Black Lives Matter came through town, their new woke pastor got them all to take pizzas out to the protesters. That's when he decided there was a problem. So you have to sit your pastor down and get him to explain to you why he is following this philosophy rather than the more biblical philosophy. Why is he obsessed by race, which is not mentioned in the Bible, which is not addressed, racism is not addressed in the Bible, because it wasn't needed to be, because it was assumed that all Christians would treat other people fairly and ethically and honestly. And so you sit them down and ask them and get into it. Do you understand the Marxist roots of this? Do you understand the non-biblical roots of this? And the movie will help you clarify that. Maybe even show him the movie if he's willing to. If he's willing to talk to you, work with him. If he's not willing to talk with you, if he's so arrogant and he thinks he knows it all, well, it's time to find another church, or to find another pastor in the same church, if you have the power to do that. Wokeism is Marxism. It's completely unbiblical. They might be very self-righteous about all of this, and they might be, they think they're so right, but they are so wrong. And you got to be strong about this. Don't tolerate any of it. Either get the pastor out of your church, change the pastor's outlook, or find another church. Those are the only options.
Yeah. And I have to say, like, before I watched the film, just seeing like the trailers and hearing, we heard about it on Jan Markell's show. And I thought I knew, like, I'm pretty aware of what's going on. So I kind of had an idea going into the film of what I thought, like, I'm pretty aware that these things are happening, but that film puts it into such a good context of the big picture. And so everybody who's watching, if you haven't seen it yet, a lot of your questions will be answered when you watch it, because it was much more than what I expected it to be. It was very eye-opening. So
it's very profound too. It actually makes you look at Christianity slightly differently, like the emphasis on love that has come into the church over law. Love is more important than law now, which is really never the emphasis in the past.
Yeah.
But people
are you saying love?
This.
Are you saying love is more important than law? Is that what you're saying?
No, law comes before love.
Right. Well, and that's something, for our group, that's something that we talk about a lot, because we we study creation, we study the Old Testament and Genesis. So we understand that the gospel is not, and this is something that the movie emphasizes, is God loves you is not the complete gospel. In fact, I think I wrote down it's too small, it's too selfish, it's incomplete, is what they say.
Well, that's right. It's all about you, isn't it? The Old Testament is very much about law. Of course, the 10 Commandments, but it's about how you defend your home. It's about how you defend your community, how you grow. It's political, it's philosophical. It's got a whole bunch of law in it. Jesus didn't come to abolish that. He came to build on it.
Yeah.
He never came to abolish the law. He said specifically that. But a lot of Christians have the idea, as long as God loves you, you're okay. You don't have to obey God's laws just as long as you love God or you love Jesus. Well, any mother or father knows you love your kids, but if they don't obey your laws, there's going to be a rupture. There's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And that's the same with us. So if you want love, keep your agreements, obey the law, obey the commandments, and that will build a far stronger relationship than just saying, gee, I really love you. Love based on law is very strong and profound. Love without law is superficial and meaningless.
Before our next question, just to clarify something somebody wrote, there's a Philip Keller, who's an author, who's written about Psalm 23. And
I don't know of the relationship. I
to
saw that question. I don't know if Philip Keller is related to Tim Keller. I just don't know. Sorry.
I know I read his book, but I'm not familiar enough with him. Like I was just saying about Tim Keller and some people, I wouldn't be able to say that he's never said anything wrong, but I definitely know that.
Look, if you read a lot of Tim Keller's books, most Christians wouldn't find anything wrong with it. You'd have to have a bit of a level of sophistication to find some of the twisted messages there, but they are there. And his Gospel Coalition and Mark Devers, and that has done a lot of damage, lot of damage. They're really bringing forth the LGBTQ movement. They've really got into this critical race theory and all of this kind of stuff, but they still say they're conservative Christians, but they're not.
No.
Mark Devers promotes actual Maoist books written by known communists, and calls it Christianity.
Yeah. Well, so similarly, Erica's asking, New Age ideas and treatments have been spreading in the church, a blending of Eastern religions and Christianity. How do we call this out and reach those who believe Taoism and Christianity are compatible?
Well, that's a matter of biblical worldview, isn't it? Look, the church has got the church, and I want to say the church, I mean American Christianity in general, and that's a very mixed bag, as you know, from people like yourselves all the way through to these liberal, gay-loving Christians of San Francisco. They all call themselves Christian. Well, New Age ideas are coming in, and New Age ideas and socialism were always intertwined. The old theosophists of the 19th century, many of them were socialists, the New Agers of the time. So it's really a biblical worldview, and holding to those standards and expecting your pastor to hold to those standards, expecting your church members to hold to those standards. Kerry Gordon makes a great point at the end of the movie. He said, we got this idea that just everybody should go to church, everybody. Well, he said, if the pastors really preached the gospel like it's written, not this dumbed down, softened down, lovey-dovey version, half the people would get up and leave.
Yeah.
They couldn't handle it. It'd be just, he says, they're living in their lukewarm sin. They couldn't handle it. And he said, that would be the best thing that could happen. Get rid of the pansies, get rid of the weak, get rid of the liars, get rid of the grifters, because 2 weeks later, God would come back to church. So yes, you may drive people out of your church. Yes, your church maybe will become smaller, but it's going to be a lot better church to go to. Yeah. It's going to be a church of strong Christians, not lukewarm Christians, not deranged Christians, not New Age Christians, not socialist Christians. It's a matter of holding to certain standards, and you've got to be very firm in your own standards and holding people to account and expecting and associating with people that hold those views and not tolerating, not putting up with those who persistently hold other views.
Yeah.
You got to have dialogue with people. But if somebody wants to come to your church and they want to go to the Buddhist temple 2 days a week as well, and then they go to the mosque once a month, well, they're not really committed to what you're about.
No.
And maybe they should find somewhere else.
Okay, so Jerry asks, are churches that don't accept the inerrancy of scripture most vulnerable to this Marxist infiltration? I can't speak.
Yeah, sorry. Carry on.
She says, I can't speak with my own cousins anymore because they read the Bible trying to explain away sin and judgment and making God look just loving and accepting and of anything and everything.
Well, so that's exactly what I'm saying, isn't it? They've abandoned sin, they've abandoned law, they've abandoned the Old Testament, they're full of situation ethics. And so God is love now. That's all God is, love. Well, that's not what it says in the Bible. God can be pretty darn tough sometimes. God can hold one, which I call loving, actually. It's more loving to hold people to account than to let them drift along in sin. But it's that very strong kind of love. So look, if you believe in the inerrancy of the Bible and that's your rock solid position, that's your position. And that's the biblical position. If others can't come up to that, you shouldn't be having them in your church, or you should treat them in a different way. This is about fortifying the remnant right now. This is about, we're living in a time of crisis, which is probably going to get much, much worse yet. And so this is about fortifying, ridding the church of the lukewarm, separating the wheat from the chaff. So, if people want to drift off and think those kind of things and you can't reason with them, well, just find people you can reason with.
Well, so then along the same line, Tony asks, we moved to a new state and are struggling to find a church where they are aware of this movement to Marxism. What would be a good approach to finding a healthy church?
Yeah, well, we're actually going to have a website where we're healthy church. We're going to have a map of every state, and every zip code we're going to put, this is a good church, that's a good church, whatever. Look, you might have to do some shopping, but you have to look online, find networks like yourself. What churches do people in your network feel comfortable with, or by reputation? Or, because if you're part of this network, you don't want anything that's really a softer message, do you? And so you might be finding a little home church somewhere. I would say, look small. Find a home church that meets in somebody's house, or in the back of a machine shop, or whatever. Like I was out in California not long ago, and they had a little church every Sunday outdoors in an Olive Garden, about 25 people. I think that's where you're more likely to find what you're looking for than going to the local mega church or whatever.
I think we may have gone to that church when the COVID happened. We all were meeting in La Mesa in a park.
Yeah, well, it probably was right too, because it was around that area.
Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, so it may well be, but
yeah,
that's the thing. Church shopping is a bit difficult these days, but smaller is usually better.
That was something I was going to ask you personally, was because I know that on the enemieswithinthechurch.com website, there's a page for Wokepedia where there's a lot of articles that are not like calling out, but yeah, calling out. I mean, like there's a whole article about Tim Keller and Andy Stanley and Rick Warren and some of the other churches and seminaries and things. So I've been wondering, I know that there's a separate page about ways to rebuild America, but I've been wondering if they would make a page like that where like, here's some good churches that we've found that you can choose from, you know. So
well, that's
good
the
to hear.
intention. That was what they were talking about a while back. I don't know how far they've gone with that, but the plan was every state, it's a map of every state, every zip code, and you identify in each zip code where the sound churches are, to
That's
make it easy for people, you know, to instead of doing a lot of trial and error. But you know, you might find that your best experience comes from a little gathering of 10 people who meet with a really, really good pastor. It really comes down to the pastor most of the time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not the denomination, it's the pastor is really the main thing to look at. Have a talk to your pastor. Do you believe in biblical inerrancy? If you know, what do you believe in? You're going to have certain non-negotiables. You go to them and say, well, these are my non-negotiables. How do you stand on each of those issues? That'll take you about 10 minutes, and you'll either decide to stay, or more likely you'll move on to somewhere else.
And I know, you know, like I said, we've heard you before on Jan Markell, and we heard Kerry Gordon on there, and of course Jack Hibbs has been on there. We heard him say one time that even if you can't, like in a case like this, if you move somewhere and you're having a hard time finding a church to attend in person that is strong like that, you can get fed online, but then still go to your local church and be a missionary to that church and start trying to work your way.
Well, that's a good point. Maintain your culture, maintain your connection, but try and move the new church. Well, that's another option, of course.
Yeah.
And that depends totally on you and what you're willing to do. But as I say, don't go to a church you don't believe in just because it's the only church in the area.
Yeah.
Because it's as I say, don't.
Yeah.
Why would listen to this on a Thursday night and go to a hippie church or a socialist church on a Sunday?
Right.
It defeats the whole purpose, really, doesn't it?
Well, so our next question comes from Bob, and he's asking, can the Marxist agenda continue, or will it be stopped in its track? I guess I would want to phrase it the other way. Do we have a hope to stop it in its tracks in the event of a currency collapse and a forced return to a hard monetary system?
Yeah, well, look. The world is clearly coming into crises. You know, communism's on the march. We've got economic meltdowns. Everything is all coming together at once. Now, this is a time when you fortify the remnant. So it's really not about trying to save every person and whatever. It's saving those around you, building networks around you, people you can rely on, building your church networks, people who can supply you with food, all of this kind of thing. You know, Marxism is well entrenched now. We're going to stop it from the local level up. And when I travel around the country, I'm seeing all these little churches. I'm seeing all these grassroots conservative groups rise up and fight back. And that's where it's going to come from, these local groups who strengthen their own communities, take over their school boards, fortify their church, and establish real communities in local areas. We do enough of that, communism will be stopped.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. Like, I don't want to give, I mean, we came here to talk about the film, and we want to talk about it, but without like giving too much away, because we really want people to watch it themselves. But you know, because we are a creation group, and most of us are familiar with Ken Ham and how he talks about answers.
He's pretty good for an Australian. It's pretty good for an Australian, isn't he?
And well, we like Ray Comfort too.
Yes, well, look, I used to, when I was a high school kid, I'd go into the square in Christchurch, and Ray Comfort would be preaching about 10 feet away from me. And I saw him many times. And then he disappeared. And it was only years later, I thought, oh, he's in America now. He's, you know, he's well known here. But I remember him when he was a newly converted hippie surfer. You know, so it's interesting.
Well, so going back to that, Ken talks a lot about how a lot of the compromise in our churches today is because pastors and Christian leaders have abandoned Genesis, have abandoned the Old Testament, have abandoned creation. And so we know that that's true, but in this film and in your film that came before it, you guys really lay out how this attack that America is under is from outside sources that have learned how to infiltrate. And I think that that's really interesting. And I have kind of a question that's outside the scope of the church talk, but I'm wondering, and we've had Alex Newman on before, and I know that you know him.
I know him well.
About recently, a former KGB agent who had defected, I believe, and he talked about how the Russians are playing this long game. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that when the wall came down, that was really the end of the Cold War, or was that part of their plan to get us to kind of, be like, oh,
exactly,
a little bit?
Well, what does C.S. Lewis say? He said, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled is to convince people he doesn't exist. Yeah. Well, that's the greatest trick the communists ever pulled. The collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism was a strategic retreat. Reagan, they knew if they didn't do something, Reagan would collapse them. So they deliberately pulled back. They kept people in power, positions of power in all these countries, and they consolidated, and they got lots of Western capital, lots of Western money. You see that particularly in China, but in Russia too. And they built themselves up to the point that they can now openly fly the flag again, like China's doing, and go back on the march. For 15 years, Vladimir Putin and the KGB have been spreading this message to American Christians and conservatives that he's one of us, that he's going to save us from the New World Order and the Soros and the LGBT agenda. Putin, he noted a conference in 2017 in Sochi, Russia. I've got it on video, of 30,000 young communists from all over the world to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, and told them the future is ours, the future is yours, go for it. What we're seeing now is Russia and China working together to change the world balance of power. And Ukraine's the first step. They're trying to take down the US dollar. Biden, their agent, just gave them Afghanistan. Taiwan's under threat. The Middle East is under threat. This is what happens when you go from a strong leader to a weak leader. The communists take advantage of that. So they're showing their flag much more than they have in the past. But yes, I believe the collapse of communism was a strategic retreat rather than a real defeat. But we treated it as a real defeat and stopped doing anything about it. And now communism is all through our society. It's in our colleges, it's in our churches, it's in our educational things, it's in Hollywood. The analogy I have is like cancer. Say if you have a tumor in your body and you cut 90% of it out, but you leave 10% in, then you stop all treatment for 30 years, what's your body going to look like?
Yeah.
And that's where we are today.
Yeah. And so that goes along. Rob is asking a question, and I think it's kind of been answered, but in the same venue. Like, it's not just like in your first film, you talked about how it's in our politicians are aligning themselves with enemies of America. But then we see from that time until this new film, the enemies within the church, how, they hit public schools, public universities, they Catholicism, and now they're coming after the moral majority and the Christian denominations and
well, the you're all Christian nationalists now.
Yeah.
You're that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
That's like almost being a Nazi. So any real Bible believing Christian is now as an enemy of the state.
Yeah.
That's what they're positioning it.
That's me.
Positioning it.
I'm raising my hand and admitting it.
So Rob is asking, what about the Boy Scouts? Because they used to be a solid organization a half century ago, but in the last 2 decades, scouting has gone downhill. Has there been any analysis of who has brought them?
Or the name is a bit sexist, it's a bit exclusionary, isn't it? Boy Scouts, well, Yeah, look, I've read articles from the 1930s where the Communist Party was attacking the Boy Scouts back then, because the Boy Scouts was a patriotic organization. It taught young men masculine virtues and self-reliance and teamwork. It was a good setup for the military or police for a lot of young men. It was a really, really positive organization. So the left had to destroy it. And they destroyed it through the LGBTQ agenda. And the first gay rights activist in America was the Communist Party member Harry Hay, who was recruited into the Communist Party by Will Geer, his homosexual lover and fellow communist, who you all know as Grandpa Walton on the Waltons. So, so the Boy Scouts was absolutely deliberately targeted. It's Christian, it's masculine, it's semi-military, all the things communists hate. So they had to destroy it, and they haven't completely destroyed it, but pretty much have.
Well,
and the countries are weaker for it.
And one of the things on that topic that's interesting in the film that was pointed out in the film is how our enemies have gotten our Democrats and our liberals, progressives, to applaud feminism, to applaud
Yes.
weak masculinity, to applaud God loves you and don't forget and don't worry about the laws, to applaud all of these things that they themselves, these countries are not embracing. Like they understand that that's what's going to bring us down, so that in their own countries, the things that are getting promoted here and endorsed, and just the sick perversion of it all is outlawed in our enemies' countries.
Well, that's right. They promote it here, but they ban it there, because here they're trying to bring us to our knees. There they're trying to get ready for war, build their country up. In China now they criticize girly men, but they promote them here because they want a strong army. They don't want homosexuals in their army. They don't want girly men in their army. They want soldiers who can carry stuff around for 50 miles and charge tanks and whatever. They want tough, brave men. They don't allow the homosexual agenda over there. They don't allow the soft stuff. You don't get welfare in China. You don't get welfare in Russia. You work for your darn living. Yeah. So even though they are communists, they're a lot tougher on their people than we are. Their school systems are way, way more rigorous than ours, because they want scientists and technicians and military officers and military engineers who can add things up and make things work and build plane engines and guns and bombs and rockets. Here they're promoting basket weaving and gender studies and all this, because they'll be our future soldiers and our future military people. We're putting our Marines in high heels, and they're getting ready for World War III. They're getting ready for World War III, and our troops are getting ready for mascara.
Wouldn't you say that
that's
that's
not an accident?
Part of the agenda, though? Yeah. Just like putting Alzheimer's 1 into the Oval Office, and then creating decimating the military. It's all a part of their
plan. Absolutely it is. This is deeply planned. The deep state is Russian, essentially, in Chinese, and their plan is, Trump was a problem, because if Trump had got another 4 more years, he was working with Japan, he was working with Australia and India to take down the Communist Party of China. And that would have been a massive boon to the world. All that energy and entrepreneurship serving good rather than evil. So they released the COVID to bring him down. They unleashed Black Lives Matter to bring him down. They stole the election. They got their agent Joe Biden into power. And while he's in power, they're going on the march. We wouldn't have had Ukraine under Trump. We wouldn't have had Taiwan under Trump. We wouldn't have had Afghanistan under Trump. They deliberately brought him down. They put their weak man in the White House, and they're taking full advantage of that. Absolutely, it's an agenda.
Well, and then one last part, and we'll start wrapping it up here, is we've talked about China and Russia because they are our active enemies that we know are working against us. But then there's North Korea, whether they're working against us or just crazy, but they're definitely emboldened by all of this too, because
and Iran, and Nicaragua. The Russians have planes in Nicaragua. They can carry nuclear weapons to this country in a couple of hours. The open borders movement is a big part of this. The Mexico now has a communist president. So he's not going to close those borders because his goal is to bring this country down, and illegal immigration is a huge part of that.
Yeah.
So wherever you look, we're under attack. And it all comes down to, this is a battle between good and evil. And it's not an evil so strong as we haven't got enough really good people.
Yeah. Well, and that was my point in bringing up North Korea. Was one of the things that Carrie Gordon talks about in the film is how Christians have been slaughtered. And, if you own a Bible, and people are giving their lives for that. But here in America, we're so willing to just give up all of our convictions and not be bothered to be uncomfortable. So
well, that's right. They think the tribulation or persecution is going to be when you have to go down from 3 cars to 2. You only take 1 holiday in the Caribbean a year instead of 2.
Yeah.
Look, Christianity was obliterated in Iraq because we had a pro-communist president at the time, Barack Obama, and ISIS took advantage of that and wiped out Christianity in the whole country. Now, I would say this: the blood of those Iraqi Christians is on the head of American Christians who allowed Barack Obama to come to power. They were either so undiscerning or so apathetic, or in some cases they stupidly voted for him, that he brought a situation where hundreds of thousands of people were slaughtered. But I'll bet you most of these Christians make no association at all with that.
Yeah.
But it's like the German Christians before World War II. There was only one group in Germany that could have stopped Hitler's rise to power, and that was the German Christians. But they didn't. They put swastikas in their churches. They became good Nazi Christians. And that led to World War II. And real young American Christians had to leave their farms in Iowa and Pennsylvania and put on uniforms and pick up guns and charge German machine guns on the beaches of Normandy to fix the mess left to us by the German Christians who couldn't be bothered. So we're in a similar situation today. We're on the verge of major breakdown. It all comes down to the state of the American church. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, that's our last defense. So, well, we are so grateful that you came, and it's nice to leave this on a note where we can remind people that the people that are here in Zoom with us, or people who are watching along on Facebook, and then the people who will be watching this on our channels in the times to come. But we want to be mindful that our faith and our Christianity and the liberties that we still have are important, and that we need to stand up for them. So if you haven't seen the film yet, make sure that you go to enemieswithinthechurch.com. You can buy the film, you can buy it on DVD and get it in the mail. You can also buy merchandise like a woke shirt, t-shirt, and other merchandise. You can also buy the film in a digital copy and watch it online. So we want to make sure that as many people as can, buy it. Christmas isn't too far off. Buy it as gifts for your pastors, and we really want to encourage people to get on board with this, because
well, thank you. We made it because it's got an important message. You can even buy it in Spanish and Portuguese now, I believe, and other languages soon. But I really thank you for that message, because we made it because we think it's necessary, and we are hoping it's going to have a big impact. And that'll be because of voices like yourself who who amplify the message around in your circles. So thank you for that.
And then Trevor, we thank you for your time. And do you want to tell people again how they can find you and follow you?
Sure. I have a website, trevorloudon.com, just Loudon is my name, trevorloudon.com. But don't Google it. Put it in the search bar at the top of the page, because apparently Google has forgotten my IP address. Can you imagine that?
Well, I found it today through Google, but
Oh,
yeah.
okay. Well, maybe it's just my computer that can't. I don't know. But anyway, I'm glad you could.
Well, and then people can find us again. We're Creation Fellowship Santee, and you can email us at creationfellowshipsantee@gmail.com. Santee is Santee. You can also find links for most of our past presentations by going to tinyurl.com/CF Santee. And then we also want to make mention too of our partner ministry, Throughout All Ages Ministries.com, and you can check them out also. And so we're going to go ahead and turn off the live stream and the recording for now. And then Trevor, if you'd like to stay back in case anybody wants to ask you a couple of questions directly in
Sure.
Zoom, that would be great. And then we'll pray to close.